Alright, this is a brief video on the U.S. policy of imperialism. Imperialism kind of began, the U.S. policy of imperialism began in the late 1890s. Imperialism is this idea of controlling another territory, and you can do that economically, politically, or militarily. The United States had interest in a variety of territories, including Hawaii, Mexico, the Philippines, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Panama, China, and Puerto Rico. The United States has interest in these territories for various reasons. Both Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii were all great for producing sugar, and sugar was a cash crop at this time. The China was great for trade, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And anyway, why did we have this interest in imperialism? And there's a couple different reasons. One is just businesses wanted new markets and new resources, much like the British used the American colonies as a way to gain resources and a market to sell their goods. So it's an idea that you try to control, become the main point where you can control trade in those areas. And it was also strategic military bases for the United States Navy. That is to also protect trade. So we're talking Hawaii, which is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And the Philippines becomes this kind of gateway to China as well. So we have these naval bases around the world, as well as U.S. corporations become more international. And it's not exactly a start of a global economy. It's more that the global economy expands as the U.S. corporations are a part of that. So, I should have written economy there, my apologies. Okay. Then we have, last year you guys studied imperialism, the mad scramble for Africa. You potentially saw this image. The idea was, the United States is late to the colonies game, as is Germany, which is one of the causes of World War I, which we'll get to later. But because of that, we're late to the game. There isn't territory in Africa left. The United States' military, while the Navy is actually fairly powerful, the military itself is not. And so we don't have any colonies in Africa. And the same thing that is this mad scramble for Africa, the same thing happens in China. And you have these different spheres of influence that France, England, Russia, Japan, and Germany all have. This, is a problem for the United States. There actually is, the United States can trade with those territories, but the United States is afraid that we will no longer be able to trade with those territories if the countries change policies. So John Hay, the Secretary of State, proposes the open door policy. And he basically wants all nations to have equal trading rights with China all over China. He also wanted to encourage foreigners to obey Chinese law and observe fair competition. It's less about trying to respect China and more a fear of losing out on the trade for China, because China was, much like we buy Chinese goods today, in this time period, China was buying Western goods. And so what John Hay does is kind of brilliant. He talks to these different countries. He sends out these open door notes and to the various countries. And Britain does agree with the open door policy, but the other nations never said anything. And so John Hay announces that it was a great success. And the other nations have to either say that, no, we disagree, and they appear greedy, or they have to just silently accept that this is the policy. The policy is never a formal treaty, but it is a policy that gets followed generally over the next few decades, although it is occasionally violated. So so this political cartoon shows kind of the U.S.'s role in the open door policy. The U.S. is shown as taller than the others. It is basically has the key to to trade in China, and the other nations are shown as less important. It's important to understand that the U.S. is able to seize upon this idea of anti-imperialism, right? Because the U.S. has no China power in China, and that they are showing that we are not really trying to gain territory. So they're able to seize on that, even though it's more about business interests and being able to sell things to China. All right, Spanish-American War took place in 1898. In the causes of it are yellow journalism, the explosion of the Maine and the Delome letter. The Basically, Spain had treated the Cuban people fairly badly. This had made it out to the papers, and papers in the United States were pushing for war or for the United States to do something. And yellow journalism was mostly just to sell newspapers, but it had some influence over policy. There was the Delome letter, which was sent between two Spanish officials and was leaked, and basically it insulted President McKinley for being a low politician who was trying to please both the Doves and the Warhawks in Congress. The Doves being the people who didn't want war, and the Warhawks, obviously, the people who did. Anyway, as a result, and then the USS Maine explodes, and newspapers through yellow journalism, but a variety of and the government officials like Teddy Roosevelt are pushing to say that Spain did it. We eventually go to war with Spain in 1898. The war is very brief. It lasts 6 months. We basically destroy most of the Spanish fleet. We take Puerto Rico. We free Cuba to some degree, though when Cuba's government is recreated, we insist on the Platt Amendment to be added to their constitution, which gives the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. So this is kind of an example, like Puerto Rico is an example of essentially military imperialism, like we just took it. Cuba is an example of political imperialism because, we did free it, but then they kind of allowed it to we wrote into their government that we had the right to intervene. And under Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, the United States built the Panama Canal. Panama was a part of Colombia, and we were in negotiations with Colombia to lease territory in Panama to build a canal. The Senate of Panama held out for more money. Teddy Roosevelt got irritated, and he basically freed Panama, created kind of this independence movement. There was one, but there are minor independence movements anywhere. Just like there are people who want Northern Virginia to be independent of Virginia, but it's not a true movement of any substance. And basically created a country. The United States is the first to recognize this country, and then the country of Panama allows the United States to have the land and control over the Panama Canal, of the land that becomes the Panama Canal, and the United States controls the Panama Canal until I believe 1999. Okay, so now we come to the Roosevelt Corollary. So Roosevelt is president from 1900 to 1901 to 1909, and Roosevelt is big on flexing American power. He sends out what is known as the Great White Fleet to show off how powerful the American Navy is. They circumnavigate the globe to basically demonstrate U.S. power. The Roosevelt Corollary is really based on the Monroe Doctrine. In fact, it's the entire reason we study the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, as I was mentioned much earlier in the year, is the idea that Monroe wanted Britain and other European nations to stay away from the Western Hemisphere and to not recolonize any of the territories that had recently become independent from Spain. And so the agreement was essentially the United States would stay out of European affairs, particularly out of colonies that were still controlled, like Cuba and Puerto Rico. Of course, now those are American, have become kind of under the American influence. So Roosevelt dusts off the Monroe Doctrine, which we never had the power to enforce anyway. And he creates this new doctrine called the Roosevelt Corollary. Basically, a lot of Caribbean nations and Latin American nations had become in debt to Europe. And the United States did not want European armies coming in, claiming to collect the debt and then recolonizing these territories. So instead, the United States collects European debt for Europe, and it's the United States that is the one that is invading various countries. This allows the United States to have more political power. We're not keeping the money from Europe, we're still giving it to Europe. And so we have this political cartoon. It shows kind of this big stick policy, which is based on like the Great White Fleet. It comes from the expression "speak softly and carry a big stick," that you do not need to threaten. You do not need to scream and yell. You just need to back up what you say. Just like in class, I'm not screaming and yelling at you to complete your homework. I'm just going to send out a progress report each week, and you'll deal with it. So anyway, this political cartoon is basically showing how we've expanded our influence throughout the Caribbean Sea. It shows Venezuela, Panama, Mexico, Cuba, and Santo Domingo, which is the capital of the Dominican Republic. And the United States is collecting debts and paying, giving that money to Europe. So it is the U.S. who has control here and not Europe. You'll also notice the names of these countries. If you follow baseball, these are the countries that play baseball, and that's a lot of because Marines invaded these countries at different times and started playing baseball. All right. Then we have the next president is President Taft, serves from 1909 to 1913, and he develops his policy of dollar diplomacy. This has kind of two approaches here. One is he's basically urging American businesses to invest in Latin America. This is partly to create wealth in those countries and the businesses. It kind of works, but the idea is that the U.S. will protect the business interests, but then use kind of this idea that we're building up the economies of these countries to exert some sort of political influence in Latin America. We use this policy to a limited degree in Asia as well, and it works to some degree, but then, so if there are a couple times when, like, the United States uses that authority or uses this influence to kind of overthrow the government of Nicaragua, then when there's to put in place a conservative government that supports the United States, and then was a challenge to that government, we sent in troops to support it. So it's sort of to help improve our big corporations, but it's also really about trying to put friendly governments in place in Latin America. And this kind of creates this idea of banana republics, governments that the United States sets up or overthrows based on the fact that a lot of these countries like Nicaragua, Costa Rica, had large banana plantations, and one of the corporations actually that is invested in them was called the United Fruit Corporation. And that became why banana became the fruit of choice for like breakfast, because it was so cheap. And it was because of these large plantations that were set up in these countries. And so anyway, again, it's not really the first era of true global economy, but the global economy has grown. And so this dollar diplomacy allows the United States, it's leveraging economic power to try to gain political influence in these countries. This is an image of the Panama Canal. It used to be that ships were built to be able to fit through the locks, but now with trade between the U.S. and China growing so much, actually ships are bigger than fit in the lock so that they can transport more goods. And finally, Asia and the Pacific. So really what starts off our imperialist era is in 1898, we annex Hawaii. Again, it's because we want to be able to control sugar. There are American-born planters who own territory and they feel their power has been threatened. So they invite the Marines to invade. We do, and we take Hawaii, eventually becomes a state. And the Philippines is quite different. So it says annexed after the Spanish-American War, which really should say purchased from Spain. Spain after the Spanish-American War for $20 million. And this is important because, in short, the Philippines, so we controlled Puerto Rico. We sort of freed Cuba. The Philippines, on the other hand, actually wanted we were purchased so we could hold on to them as a colony. And the Philippines really didn't want to be a colony. And so this is a timeline of, and you're not responsible for all the information in this timeline, but it's here to show you that essentially, after the US's war with Spain, you have, because the war lasted a very short period of time, you have in September that in the Philippines, they have founded the first Republican government in all of Asia with a Republican constitution. So they have set up this government. But the United States sends troops essentially to this area because they've bought it for $20 million and they want to control it. And so essentially war breaks out between the Filipinos and the Americans. And there are a lot of bloody battles. Eventually, we've destroyed most of the Filipino regular army, and so they switched to a guerrilla warfare from conventional. The major point here is to show that the Philippines were not looking forward to being a colony of the United States. And we're going to look at a couple political cartoons from the time period on imperialism. And you will be looking at more on your own, either in class or at home. But I wanted to show a couple to you. So here's one. It's from Judge in 1899. And what I want you to really see is that this is showing both the American and the Brit, so Uncle Sam's representing the United States, and this guy representing in the red coat representing England, showing the Western powers carrying native peoples or native countries to civilization up here, and carrying it over barbarism and oppression and ignorance and vice and brutality and superstition, cannibalism, slavery. And, so this is Cuba. The other countries you can't really read, but you get the peoples that we controlled after the Spanish-American War. This is India and other countries. So this is basically showing the positive of imperialism. It's this idea that it was, for those of you who've read Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden poem, this is taking that poem literally and saying that this is the white man, or like the Western powers' responsibility to bring people who have not yet come to what their vision of civilization was to civilization. And this cartoon, and so this is obviously a pro-imperialist cartoon, and this cartoon shows almost the exact opposite image. And it's an anti-imperialist cartoon from Life magazine. And it shows, the title, as always, political cartoons, you need to read the words, The White Man's Burden, but it's got a question mark after the white, because really who is bearing the burden? And you see the native peoples being, having to carry the United States. So it's these are kind of showing the different viewpoints of imperialism in this time period. Is imperialism a positive or a negative? And so what we're going to do next, depending on when you're watching this, you will either be doing this in class or on your own at home. And you're going to look through a number of these cartoons. There are 12 more. And you're just responsible for kind of understanding what's going on. Anyway, if you have any questions, please send me an email or ask me in class.